The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Democrats prepare an assault on Donald Trump, the likes of which we have rarely, if ever, witnessed. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We'll tell you what the Democrats have in mind when they take over control of the House of Representatives next month, all centered around the target they have placed on the back of President Donald J. Trump. Climate change will shrink the U.S. economy and kill thousands. That, according to the latest environmental report released by the U.S. government, is this fact or fiction? We'll talk it over with Dr. Bonner Cohen, environmental expert from the National Council for Public Policy Research. Plus, following the many tributes offered to the late 41st President George H.W. Bush this week, we'll examine some things about his legacy and presidency that the establishment media overlooked or ignored.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, as we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The Democrats are chomping at the bit to launch all manner of investigations of President Trump when they take control of the House of Representatives next month. And the incoming Democratic chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, the man who will hold subpoena power, Jerry Nadler, actually did a remarkable thing in going on MSNBC and describing his reaction to the chants of the Trump faithful during the presidential campaign about Hillary Clinton. Lock her up.
Oh, my God. You've got a candidate and a spokesman for a candidate who have lost all sight of American traditions and a democratic tradition, and who try to make enemies of their opponents and use the power of and threaten to use the power of law for political purposes. And that is very dangerous. And, of course, we now know that this president lies incessantly about everything. And one thing I think we know now is that his period of being able to lie incessantly and not being called to account is coming to an end.
An ominous signal that Nadler and his leftist colleagues will investigate Trump till they drop. But Nadler probably didn't even realize that in that statement he demonstrated complete hypocrisy, attacking Trump for criminalizing his opponent, and then proceeding to do essentially the same thing about Trump. Buckle your seatbelts, folks. The ride is about to get awfully bumpy. One of the dozens of Democrats considering a run against Trump in 2020, New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, tweeted out this week that our future is female, intersectional, powered by our belief in one another. And we're just getting started. Political commentator Heather McDonald went on Fox News and said the former moderate and now newly woke senator is entirely representative of the leftward lurch of today's Democratic Party.
I wish this was something that was just confined to Gillibrand, but it's not. Yeah. It means that feminism has ambitions to take over civilization, and when that happens, you can say goodbye to civilization. They're trying to disappear males. They're committed to a narrative that America is a rape culture is oppressive, is sexist, is racist. That's the whole concept of intersectionality, which is a way of describing the growing number of victims and their complicated ways of being oppressed by white heterosexual males.
Yep, the more you demonize white men and expand the victim pool, apparently, the more likely you are to find favor with the Democrats' leftist base. Another major issue on the progressive left, of course, is illegal immigration, with a bunch of elected Democrats actually calling for the end of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and calling for essentially open borders. But political strategist Ned Ryan went on Fox News and said it's not just Democrats who are to blame.
We've gotten to this point because of an unholy alliance between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats for political gain, Republicans for business gain. Think about the economic future of what we're looking at. It gets pretty grim. And the question that people aren't asking, and I think they need to start asking, is if we continue to bring in a lot of low-skilled and unskilled laborers, a lot of whom are coming illegally, what happens when mass automation hits and all of those unskilled or low-skilled laborers get thrown out of work? You're either going to have violence and rioting in the streets, or we're going to have to put them on our social welfare systems, which are already failing. And the only way those get funded is that we get to pay even greater taxes, life-crushing, draconian taxes, to fund those social welfare programs.
So your choice is Democrats who publicly call for essentially open borders, and the many Republicans who publicly call for tough enforcement of immigration laws, but don't really mean it. One side is wrong, the other hypocritical. Some choice. Meanwhile, Russia, or collusion with Russia, remains a hot topic among wishful thinkers on the left. Their fantasy that Trump schemed to collude with Russia and steal the election from Hillary Clinton is hardly without consequences. As longtime liberal expert on all things Russia, Stephen Cohen, pointed out on Fox News, the Democrats have tied Trump's hands on a vital international relationship.
For the first time since President Eisenhower, a president of the United States, Donald Trump, is not free to keep us from war with Russia. We're embroiled in crises that are fraught with hot war, not just Cold War, from Syria to Ukraine. Because of these Russiagate allegations, Trump feels not free to deal with Putin in terms of national security. Think back to John Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. President Kennedy was free to negotiate with the Kremlin leader to avoid nuclear war. That is not the case today, and that's why I think the danger of war with Russia, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis, is greater in my lifetime, in history, than it's ever been.
But war with Russia might well be worth it for the left if they can get rid of Trump in the process. Meanwhile, Trump soldiers on in his showdown with China. He met with Chinese President for life Xi Jinping at the G20 summit in Argentina last week amid hopeful signs regarding our massive trade deficit with China and other things, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin.
This is the first time you've had a direct agreement between the two presidents, President Xi and President Trump. I think President Xi made some very strong commitments on changing structural and non-structural issues. And if we can get this negotiated and get a real agreement, I think this is the single biggest opportunity for U.S. business and U.S. workers. President Trump has always been focused on the structural issues, including IP and technology and forced joint ventures. And what he's always said, and we've said to China, is that if we can correct these issues and they open their markets, the trade deficit will take care of itself.
By the way, forced joint ventures means that Chinese companies force American companies to share their technology as a condition of partnership, which allows them to steal technology. And, of course, intellectual property theft has become one of the defining traits of China for some time, costing the U.S. untold billions of dollars. We close with what I call the bookend to Hillary Clinton's infamous basket of deplorable statement. That was all about how deplorable Trump supporters are. But Hawaii Senator Mazie Hirono says the flip side of that is that the Democrats are brilliant.
We Democrats know so much. That is true. And we have to kind of tell everybody how smart we are.
Isn't that what Hillary Clinton kept saying in 2016? We'll take a quick break, and then we're back to discuss climate change and the government's latest predictions of environmental and economic catastrophe.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Climate change will shrink U.S. economy and kill thousands, government report warns. So read the breathless, screaming headlines on CNN and elsewhere in the establishment media following the release of a government environmental report, specifically the fourth climate assessment report by the Trump administration, though not Trump himself. He disavowed any personal association with it. Are we approaching the eve of destruction, as environmental activists would have us believe? Is the report exaggerated or imprecise? Is the whole climate change issue so vital to the left, in fact, a hoax, as some conservatives believe? Joining us to separate fact from fiction on climate change is Dr. Bonner Cohen, senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, where he concentrates on environmental issues. Dr. Cohen, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here.
I will stipulate at the outset that I have a rather limited knowledge of climate change, didn't do well in science courses in school, but I know enough to ask you to assess the predictions in this environmental report that climate change over the next several decades will cause the economy to lose hundreds of billions of dollars, or in the worst case scenario, more than 10% of its GDP by the end of the century.
After having read the report, I believe that the people who wrote the report also have a very limited understanding of the many variables that go into our ever-changing climate. The report, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand this, is being portrayed in the media as a Trump administration report. It is nothing of the sort. It is a report that is mandated by Congress to be updated and released every few years. This report has been in the works for years. It began actually under the Obama administration and is almost entirely the product of career officials. We will call these the climate deep state, embedded in federal agencies from NOAA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, and many others. These are the people who put this report together, and they did so that they could produce a document that was an embarrassment to the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. Why did the Trump administration allow this to happen? Well, actually, it's its own fault, because during the time that the document was being put together, there weren't enough political appointees in the Trump administration to put a stop to this.
Right.
About the only thing they got right was releasing the report the day after Thanksgiving. All that said, the document is exactly what one would expect. It is scare propaganda, one that assumes the whole legitimacy of the argument that man-made emissions of greenhouse gases are artificially and dangerously warming the planet. And if we do not take urgent action and take it now, all sorts of disasters will take place, such as the usual litany, rising sea levels, soaring temperatures, and the like. The language in this is purposely designed to scare people to death. and to provide an excuse for all sorts of groups to sue the government to take action on climate change and to do away with Trump deregulatory actions.
This talk of climate change is not new. We've heard this for many years. Have the environmental activists, foremost among them Al Gore, who basically brought this issue into the public consciousness with his Inconvenient Truth book and movie, have these people been held accountable for the predictions they made over a decade ago? And how accurate were those predictions?
Those predictions were way off. They weren't close to being accurate. That's why something that used to be called global warming was relabeled climate change. That gave them a little cover. So just in case we have an unusual cold winter, as we have had, contrary to all their predictions, well, that's climate change. Too much rain, too little rain, what have you, that we are told is a reflection of climate change. Under the theory, man-made emissions of greenhouse gases, which we are told are heat-trapping gases, should lead to a rise in temperature in a linear fashion. Well, it has not. In fact, there has been absolutely no rise in temperatures over the last 20 years. And they've adopted a term, climate change, which is actually redundant because climates always change.
Really? Who knew? Who knew?
Right.
Who knew
Right.
that? Who knew that the weather changes?
During the age of the dinosaurs, for example, there was absolutely no ice on either the North Pole or the South Pole. And atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, CO2, were as much as 20 times higher than what we are experiencing today. 250 years ago, we were at the end of what is known as the Little Ice Age, which, aside from being a much cooler planet than what we have now, atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide were only around 250 parts per million. Today, they are around 400 parts per million, and for that, we should be very thankful because higher levels of CO2 are very good for agriculture and good for greening the planet. The last thing we want to do is keep CO2 levels artificially low because we have 8 billion people to feed on this planet, some of whom are right on the edge of starvation, and we need to produce as much food as possible to do that, and CO2 levels are tremendous benefit to agriculture. So just think, the last 2 million years, which in geological terms is nothing, we have had 17 ice ages.
Wow.
On 17 different occasions, the Earth has cooled off so much that we had gigantic glaciers stretching from the North Pole as far south as Kentucky that were as thick as 2 miles. And on 17 different occasions, for reasons we quite frankly don't understand, those ice ages came to an end, and all of those gigantic sheets of ice melted. We're living now in an interglacial period, which means we're living between the last ice age and the next one. And that's the real climate change we ought to be worried about, not the climate change of fear-mongering environmentalists who are simply trying to create a market for renewable energy, which is one of their biggest sources of funding, but rather what happens if the Earth starts to cool, because that is something that will be very detrimental to human health and the environment.
Thank you so much for joining us. You've enlightened me and hopefully our listeners as well.
Thank you.
Dr. Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, most of us spent some time over the last week hearing about the legacy of George Herbert Walker Bush. The nation paused on Wednesday for the state funeral of the 41st president, Amid much talk of character, temperament, dignity, and so forth, of course, so many of those offering praise were the same ones who were hardly so laudatory of the man when he was still alive, and especially when he was president. But that's easily explained. The death of Bush 41 was yet another opportunity for the elite media to attack President Trump by contrasting Bush's quiet dignity with Trump's brash, bombastic personality. It seemed the media covered most every element of Bush's life and times in their end-to-end coverage of his death and his state funeral, but whether deliberate or not, they missed or overlooked or ignored some vital points about his legacy. Here's one of them. After the 70-year Cold War ended, 7 decades of nuclear tension, countless trillions of dollars spent defending ourselves against the Soviet Union, and unspeakable human suffering by millions in Russia and in Eastern Europe under the boot of communist tyranny, a twilight struggle of freedom against totalitarianism, Bush said not one word about the victory for our way of life. We heard a lot this week about Bush's refusal to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But here's the question. How could the President of the United States fail to acknowledge, even in carefully selected diplomatic language, the fact that freedom had won its greatest victory in the history of mankind, vanquishing a totalitarian regime responsible for the deaths of some 100 million people and creating what a once obscure but then famous political scientist named Francis Fukuyama called the end of history? But Bush spoke only of the winds of change. Now, if Ronald Reagan, who along with Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul were most responsible for taking down the Soviet Empire, if he was still president, he would hardly have characterized the fall of the Soviet Union as simply a product of the winds of change. Furthermore, after that Cold War ended, Bush was asked about all the treasure we would surely save since we had just vanquished what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire. The popular expression at the time was the peace dividend. But Bush said categorically, there is no peace dividend. Really? After spending trillions of dollars fighting a powerful enemy that had finally been discarded into the ash heap of history, there was no peace dividend? And then there's the matter of Bush's New World Order, a phrase he introduced into the American lexicon in a speech outlining his plan for the Gulf War when we kicked the invading Iraqis out of Kuwait.
We are Americans, part of something larger than ourselves. For 2 centuries, we've done the hard work of freedom, and tonight we lead the world in facing down a threat to decency and humanity. What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind.
Well, it is that very new world order that Americans rejected in the most recent presidential election, and globalists struggle mightily to hold off the growing tide of nationalist movements in Europe. Bush's New World Order has clearly frayed and become increasingly unpopular, and that's a big reason Donald Trump was elected president. Then there was something discussed only peripherally and only in a positive vein this week. Bush's war on drugs, the first thing he spoke about when he became president.
Congress needs not only to act on this national drug strategy, but also to act on our crime package announced last May, a package to toughen sentences, beef up law enforcement, and build new prison space for 24,000 inmates. You and I both know the federal government can't do it alone. The states need to match tougher federal laws with tougher laws of their own. Stiffer bail, probation, parole, and sentencing. Victory over drugs is our cause, a just cause. And with your help, we are going to win.
Well, he and his fellow drug warriors did not win. Convictions for drug offenders soared, and the lives of many a nonviolent drug user was interrupted or ruined. But drugs today are cheaper, stronger, and more widely available than ever before, and 10 states have now legalized recreational marijuana. Bush's war on drugs was a failure, pure and simple, in both human and economic terms. Then there's the matter of this famous Bush promise and his message about Democrats at the time.
They'll push and I'll say no, and they'll push again and I'll say to them, read my lips.
Now, most of us know now, if we didn't before, that Bush was beaten in his bid for a second term in part because of that broken promise. But it was what was revealed about Bush in raising taxes that few in the media have spoken of. It was Bush's lack of a foundational ideology beyond duty, honor, country, which every president supports. Bush raised taxes because, unlike the man most responsible for Bush's ascent to the presidency, his predecessor Ronald Reagan, Bush saw raising taxes as just political compromise and didn't have a foundational political philosophy, an ideological North Star to stop himself from doing what he'd promised not to do. And then, finally, there was this.
I want a kinder and gentler nation.
Bush said that at the Republican convention in 1988, coming after the bold, brash, plain-spoken language and history-altering actions of his benefactor and predecessor, Ronald Reagan. This was a head-shaker. A kinder, gentler nation. To which Nancy Reagan was said to reply, kinder and gentler than what? We'll break away and come back to discuss Bush's record on liberty with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you back to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, and it is self-explanatory as we welcome in our constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, regular contributor to the show, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hi, Tim.
All right, let's talk George H.W. Bush from the vantage point of liberty. His stance on liberty, or his record on liberty as a one-term, four-year president.
Tim, I'm confident going forward, saying it was an unmitigated failure, that President Bush's unquenching thirst for more and more drug war led to and was the cause of much of the real crackdown on liberty that surrounds us all as Americans, that we've seen decrease since the 1980s with the advent of that war and the pressures that it's had on our right to travel, our right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, all these sorts of things. George Bush helped plant and water that garden. And
how would you compare Bush's record on liberty to his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, and his successor, Bill Clinton?
I would say that the fire had already been lit, but Bush poured gasoline on the fire during his presidency for these things.
You're talking about the Just Say No campaign of Nancy Reagan?
The Just Say No campaign in and of itself, I don't think was necessarily anti-liberty. In fact, by literally just saying to people, here's how you can refuse the offering of drugs.
Of your own volition.
I mean, that actually, she caught a lot of hell for that, Tim, but I don't think it was that bad a deal. I think Nancy Reagan, that was a good thing. It wasn't, hey, let's lock kids up. And then when you get to Bush, Then you have the real ramping up where they're mandating and requiring the state and locals to get heavy. Bush, in his first televised appearance to the American people as president of the United States, asked for more money from Congress for the drug war, for prisons, and asked for state and local authorities to be more restrictive on bail, to give harsher sentences. I mean, this was the marrow of his presidency, short though it was about increasing criminal penalties for people for crimes that lots of folks, Tim, don't even think belong in the federal criminal law.
Mm-hmm. Now, I heard among the many people who were reminiscing about George H.W. Bush over the last week since he died was Bill Bennett, who was famously his drug czar and the man who really launched at Bush's initiative the drug war. Now, Bennett made the claim that, and I forget whether this was just marijuana, whether it was heavy drugs, whether it was just crack, or whether it included cocaine as well. He said their war on drugs managed to reduce drug use by 71%. I don't know what metric exactly he's using, but what about the people who were spared? I'm playing devil's advocate here. What about the people who were spared crack and cocaine addiction because of Bush's war on drugs?
That you could make a case that there are some people for whom that's true. I think it's an infinitesimal number compared to the people whose lives were crushed by it. Where Bill Bennett gets his statistics, I don't know. But I haven't seen that published in any reputable journal that tracks these things. And we know, Tim, that every year since George W. Bush was vice president of the United States, since he got started in the CIA, that the drugs have, as markets will do, yielded pure drugs for less cost. Excuse me. So the person on the street can buy cocaine at a pure level for less cost today than they could in 2008, in 2000, in 1998, and 1988. And so, what do we have to say about that? Except that it's been an unmitigated failure. Except for if you are a prison guard or a politician who gets votes for get tough on crime policies, the spending on the backs of these victims has been remarkable. And to the few people who may have been saved, I would say I'm glad they were saved. I'm devastated that the mechanism by which Bill Bennett and especially George Herbert Walker Bush chose to save them was by burying a lot of other Americans under the prisons for their own medical weakness, if at best.
It's interesting that this has come up asking about Nancy Reagan versus George H.W. Bush. One was the power of persuasion, and the other was the power of law. All right, next up, I'll give you the key phrases, and you're gonna jump to it from there. Dual sovereignty, double jeopardy, Supreme Court.
Yes, sir.
How do those three expressions tie together?
Okay, there was a big case heard at the Supreme Court, the Gamble case, and Mr. Gamble was riding dirty in his car. He had a gun and some weed, and he was a felon. He had been previously convicted of a felony. And he was charged by Alabama, I believe, with the crime of being a felon in possession of a firearm. And he got convicted of it. He had to do a year's time for that. And the feds also moved to prosecute and convict him, and they did. He agreed he did have a plea agreement where he pled guilty, but allowed himself the caveat, if you will, under the plea that he could challenge the constitutionality of this separate prosecution at the federal level, again, for the same acts that the state prosecuted him with. Gamble says this is a clear violation of the double jeopardy clause. The Fifth Amendment guarantees that I will not be twice put in jeopardy for the same act, and that's what this does. Now, the Supreme Court a long time ago said that was okay, Tim, under Prohibition-era cases, where some bootleggers were being prosecuted under a state law and the federal prohibition laws, and the Supreme Court said that it was okay. And in fact, because the Fifth Amendment was not incorporated against the states, which is to say that it was only a protection against federal action at the time. Right. Again, this is during Prohibition. This is the 1920s. Well, we've had a sea change in constitutional law since then now, Tim. Incorporation, which is the process by which the Supreme Court says we're going to hold a provision of the Bill of Rights protects people from state government action as well as federal government action. The the part of the Fifth Amendment that this right rests on, this double jeopardy protection, has been incorporated. It was incorporated in the 1960s, in a case which name escapes my memory. But in any case, that has been incorporated. So the question now becomes, with the incorporation being the case, and because that was one of the reasons why the court in the 20s said these dual prosecutions are okay, can we now go ahead and say they're not okay, that in fact it does violate the constitutional rights of the accused? And I would say, Tim, the state and the federal government's position right now is that you would have to beat two criminal trials, a state criminal trial and a federal criminal trial, to go free on any given charge where there may be overlapping statutes. The other thing to bear in mind as we consider it is the federal criminal law since the 1920s has grown like a weed doesn't begin to describe.
Exponentially.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exponentially. And so almost every activity that we may do that's violative of state law is also violative of the federal law. Now,
it's like what they say, no matter what it is you're doing in life, you're breaking some kind of law.
3 Felonies a Day is a great book that people should read about that very thing.
That the average person commits 3 potential felonies a day.
It's anathema to liberty to require a person to beat 2 criminal trials. And while that won't happen to most people, to the people that it does happen to, the Constitution should not allow it. That's what Mr. Gamble and those of us who honor liberty seem to be saying in this case.
Back before I had studied as much as I've studied today, I couldn't understand after O.J. Simpson was exonerated, was found not guilty of the charges of murder famously in the mid-1990s. I was stunned that he would then face a civil trial for wrongful death, which, of course, he lost because it only requires a majority of the jury, and it basically bankrupted him, basically took every dime that he had. But that's distinct, right? A civil trial to follow a criminal trial where the defendant is found not guilty.
Okay, so there's a couple issues there to unpack. Firstly, with the O.J. thing, you said, just to correct, you said a majority of the jury. It's so unanimity of a jury is commonly required in the criminal law, but it's not always required in the criminal law. And for O.J., it's not just that it just be a majority jury, but the standard itself that they would be judging on. And that civil law standard is a preponderance of the evidence, or just one more than 50%.
And that's an important distinction as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt.
So here we're just dealing with criminal standards, but there are 2 separate criminal trials. And it would be like if the state of California prosecuted O.J., and they lost, and then at the federal level, he was prosecuted. And we've actually talked about these cases.
Well, this happened with Rodney King, right?
It often happens with police officers, where they are then prosecuted federally when local prosecutions fail.
On civil rights charges,
on civil rights charges, yes. And as a matter of fact, I definitely did a deep dive on this case. I don't always read all the amicus briefs that are submitted with a Supreme Court case, but I happen to read a lot of them in this one. And one of the briefs submitted was by the Thurgood Marshall Center for Civil Rights, I think it's called, at Howard's Law School in D.C. And they wrote their brief, Tim, in support of neither party. So they didn't support the Mr. Gamble, the prisoner's contention that he should be set free and not have to undergo the double jeopardy, and also the government's position that it was okay. They didn't support either one. They said simply that no matter how the court crafts their decision in this case, it should leave open the idea that police officers or government officials, right, who do wrong, that this is the sort of main civil rights remedy currently at law.
Well, I have to tell you, just in terms of a total non sequitur to end on, there's one good thing about double jeopardy. The movie.
Ashley Judd
Double Jeopardy. No, the old one.
Oh, the old one?
The old one.
They make one.
Wait a minute. No, you're right. It was with Tommy Lee Jones.
Okay, there you go.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, are available to you on demand. That means you can get it anytime you want at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.